perceive the evaluative comments as more harsh and more negative. So there was good support for that assumption at least. We then created a second set of feedback where it was the opposite way around. So the directive comments were the ones that felt really mean, and the evaluative comments were the ones that were more supportive. So what did we find here? Okay, so what I'm showing you now is the data from the group where, kind of similar to every study we've done before, the evaluative comments were the ones that were presented in a more harsh way. As you might expect by now, we found an evaluative recall bias. The important thing is, and what we might expect if this effect is driven by negative emotion, is that these bars effectively flip around, that you suddenly get really good recall for the directive feedback and low recall for the evaluative feedback. So do the bars flip around? Drumming up suspense here. No. Maybe the effect is a bit smaller there, there's nothing statistically significant, but it's certainly not that complete reversal of the effect that you would expect if it was driven by negative emotion. So it is true that the evaluative comments are perceived more harshly, but it doesn't seem true that that's the reason why they're remembered very well. Right, really running out of slide. This was the point where I said to my colleague, we need to stop listening to people's advice at conferences, because they're coming up with terrible ideas and they're wasting our resources. So let's think about this ourselves. And the idea that we came up with, we kind of said, let's go back to all the data we've got and really think about this, rather than just doing the next study and the next study and the next study. And we thought, everything we've got so far suggests that this effect is not happening at the point at which people are encoding this information. They're spending equal amounts of time reading it. We've got some data which I haven't shown you here showing that when you use a recognition test, you don't get the effect, which would suggest that that information maybe is in people's memory, even if they're not retrieving it. And a couple of other related findings like that. So we said, it seems like this is happening at the point they're actually trying to remember this information. So maybe what's going on here is that people are, when they try to remember feedback, they're selectively searching their memory for judgmental criticism. That's the kind of information that they're just trying to recall from memory. And we thought if that were the case, we ought to find that the effect would go away if we explicitly prompt people during the memory test to separately think about how you've done, what was the information you were given about how you did, and what was the information you were given about how you could improve. If you're prompting people to get out of that selective mindset, then that should get rid of the effect. So we did that. And we've got 3 more experiments here. I'm just putting them all under the same bracket here. It's the same methodology as before. The online, well, the version where people didn't do the, sorry, let me say this again. One of these experiments involved people doing the persuasive writing task and then remembering their own feedback. 2 of these involved the version where they just saw someone else's feedback. They're otherwise all the same, so the presentation of feedback, followed by a filler task, followed by a recall test. The only difference we added in these experiments was that at the point of recall, one group of people did a free recall test, as in all of the other experiments I've already shown you. One group of people did a structured recall, where, in the way I've described, some people, they were asked separately about how they'd done and about how they could improve. And just kind of a nice experimental design, we counterbalanced the order of those. So some people were asked first about how they'd done and then about how to improve. That's the evaluative first group. And some people were asked first about how they could improve and then about how they'd done. That's the directive first group. Does that make sense? Okay, lovely. So basically the only thing we're adding here is that we're testing them in different ways. So I'm showing you the results of these 3 experiments in a slightly different way here. This is basically a meta-analysed effect size, which probably may not make any sense. Essentially, all you need to know is anything above 0 means that there's an evaluative recall bias. Anything below 0 would mean the opposite. So in the free recall group, as you might expect, we find an evaluative recall bias. This is kind of averaged across all 3 studies. In the other 2 groups, we're expecting the effect might go away because we're testing explicitly what they we're forcing them to think about how they could improve. What we found was some support for that. The effect hasn't completely gone away in the directive first group, but it certainly has in the evaluative first group, which is kind of weird because we hadn't actually predicted there to be a difference between those two groups. Nothing's ever easy. But it does look like for the first time we're finding some support for an actual explanation. What we also found was something equally strange, which was that people in the evaluative first group also remembered significantly more feedback overall than the other two groups. So that is weird. We didn't predict that at all. And when we looked at the data, what it looked like is that these people, they're asked first, so the evaluative first group, they're asked first, tell me how you've done, and they did that, just comparably to everyone else. But then on that second attempt where we said to them, how could you improve? Suddenly loads of new information came out that they hadn't reported before. They were able to recall loads more information in a way that the directive first group hadn't been able to do. So it's almost as though these people are remembering and are able to remember directive feedback, but only if they've got the criticism out of their heads first. That seems kind of meaningful to me. This was found in all three of these experiments very robustly. So people don't seem to be able to focus on how to improve until they've stopped thinking about how they've done. I'll come back to that shortly. So yes, on my very last line of the slide, it seems there's some support for selective memory search. But we then wanted to know why. Why would people have this kind of weird thing of selectively searching for that kind of information? And we thought maybe this reminded me of research in the memory literature on schemas, that people, when they have a kind of certain way of thinking about something or of understanding something, they will search their memories for information that fits that schema. Maybe people have a schema of feedback, despite what everyone says that feedback is about improvement and so forth. Maybe people understand feedback as being past-oriented, really. It's judgment, it's criticism. And maybe that schema is what's driving or guiding people's memory search process. So we thought, how can we test that? We thought we'd take a completely different approach here. We used a completely new set of feedback stimuli. This time, it was describing this weird process. It was a bit like MasterChef type feedback. It seemed to be describing someone's activities in the kitchen of making something. It wasn't ever quite clear what they were making. And we thought we can present this feedback both as kind of criticism and as directive and as evaluative. So for example, in our stimuli here we had evaluative feedback. You also did not wash the carrots thoroughly enough. Some of them are still dirty. And directive feedback. You also need, oh I missed the typo there. You also need to wash the carrots more thoroughly, ensuring that there's no dirt left on. This is clearly very weird. But we did this with this different approach because we wanted to create a separate set of feedback that didn't feel judgmental. So we created this second set that was purely descriptive. It was telling people this is what you've done so far and this is what you'll be doing next. So for example, additionally you've prepared the carrots by washing them to remove any dirt, or you will then need to prepare the carrots by washing them to remove any dirt. So as you can see, it's kind of the same feedback again, but in the top two, it's kind of judging someone's failures in washing these carrots thoroughly, whereas the bottom two, the kind of non-judgmental, just advice, it's not even advice, it's just a description of what has and hasn't yet been done. There's no judgment here, it doesn't feel like feedback. So we thought, if it's this schema going on, we should get rid of the effect for the descriptive comments, but still see the effect for the judgmental comments. So what we found, evaluative recall bias, which I'd say, just to take a step aside, is interesting because this is the first time we've shown it with non-educational type feedback. And maybe that starts us to think about how we receive feedback in other areas of our lives. When we're told we haven't done the washing up very well, for example. Just to use one from this morning. But when it was description, when it was just, you have done this, next you will be doing that, nothing. So the difference between next you will be doing this versus you need to do this better next time seems to be a significant difference. The element of judgment there seems to be what is contributing to people failing to remember that information. So again, selective memory search, but not just selective memory search, it seems to be schematic memory search. And that seems to be the evidence that we've got at the moment. Now you might be thinking, before I finish off and start to draw things to an end, you might be thinking, yeah, but these are all lab studies. Does this actually relate to anything I see in the classroom? Is this a real effect? And I can begin to answer that, only begin, because we've recently been doing a project funded by AQA, looking at exactly this using a field study in real A-level classrooms. What we've done is gone into these colleges, obviously with permission, and we've photocopied the feedback that students have received on a mock A-level sociology paper, and we've gone back a week later and we've given the students a memory test, what they can remember from their feedback that their own teacher has given them. So this is not structured feedback, this is just the spontaneous feedback that they would have normally received. So we did this with 80 people. This is our first study. We're currently doing a much bigger follow-up. And the analysis I can present to you is based only on 37 of those people who had received at least one comment in a directive style and at least one comment in an evaluative style. So it is very small. Treat this as very preliminary at the moment. But what we found is hints of, let's say, an evaluative recall bias. Probably the more depressing thing is when you see all this white space at the top of the feedback that they're not remembering. But let's not dwell on that. So yeah, first indications are then that maybe this is something that is happening in real classrooms and in other areas of life as well where we're receiving feedback. So just to draw some messages out of everything I've shown you. I guess one is science is hard. Or sometimes if something really irritates you, like the fact that you're spending feedback all the time and the students never read it, maybe devote your entire life to studying that. That somehow feels rewarding in a different way. Conclusion one, your students probably forget most of your feedback. Sorry about that. Conclusion two, all of that super feed-forward that you're producing, writing for your students is super, super forgettable. Sorry about that as well. But that's not too constructive. What we find just as a kind of theoretical take-home, hopefully I've convinced you now, when people are trying to recall advice or feedback, they tend to focus, our data suggests, they focus on retrieving criticism, judgment of something that's already happened, and that seems to mean that they fail to search their memories fully or thoroughly. That might be because of a kind of maladaptive feedback schema or advice schema that we have, despite us all saying feedback is future-oriented, it's about improvement. In our mind of minds, we really believe it's just someone judging us. And we do find that explicitly prompting people to think about how they can improve can help people to search their memories more fully. But we also find that seems to only be successful if they've already emptied their minds of criticism. And that maybe lends itself to some kind of intervention that we haven't yet done or provided evidence for, but it seems meaningful to me. So does this all mean then that we should all stop doing this feed-forward thing? We should all stop giving future-oriented advice to students? No. Please do not take that as my one take-home message from today. That is not what I'm saying here. Nothing that we've found, nothing that we've done, undermines the likelihood that future-oriented feedback is very, very useful for students, and perhaps even more useful than past-oriented feedback. The way I frame it is this. People tend to be really poor at remembering other people's names, but we don't suggest that we stop naming people. Right? So that isn't the solution. What is the solution? Well, or what is the take home? Just because you are giving this feed forward to students doesn't mean that that's what they're hearing. You might be thinking that you're giving them really supportive advice for improvement, but they're probably hearing it as criticism nonetheless, so that isn't the entire solution. And also, importantly, just because you're giving students this exact feedback that they say they want, or this future-oriented feedback, doesn't mean that they're actually going to be equipped to use it well. It doesn't mean they're going to have the skills to be able to do something with it, just because you've written it in the future tense. And I would argue that one consequence here is these cynical quick fixes, that we can improve our practice just by writing the future tense, not only probably don't pay off, but they can sometimes have these weird and perverse counter effects that no one would have ever predicted, even the scientists who are studying this stuff. So these quick fixes are probably not going to solve the problem. Now what we could do is we could all go and try and implement things in our teaching that are going to improve students' memory for the feedback that they receive. And that would probably be a very good thing, getting them to engage in it in a way that's more memorable. That might work, that might be a good thing for us to do. But, and I'm kind of selling myself out for a job here, I'm not even sure that that's the solution. What we need to be doing is almost taking memory out of the equation. How can we just make them so that they go back to their feedback and read it again? How can we make them not burn it? Because most of the time when, if I'm receiving feedback on something that I'm trying to publish, I don't read the email once and then delete it. I have to act upon every single one of those comments and revisit that email over and over and over and over again. So probably the solution isn't necessarily even memory-based. The solution is just something more about how we actually get students to engage with the feedback more robustly and to revisit it rather than having to take it all in on that very first and often only occasion where they're actually going to do something with it. So I'll leave it there. And thank you for your attention. I hope to receive some of your evaluative feedback.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. Feedback is, I think, the bane of our lives, actually. It sounds like it still is. We have got time for a couple of questions, so actually we can...
Yes.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. All right. Good morning. Most interesting having had a lot of experience of that, both as an editor as well as a teacher. 2 points really. One from my own personal experience as an editor, where I used to be very critical, telling people what they'd done wrong. And one day I just wrote to somebody and said, it would be helpful if you could add more, or you could look at this, or you could revise that. And I got amazing comments thanking me for my great insight. When I was just really saying previously, by turning it around into a positive. The other point I'd raise with you is this. We're all familiar with Festinger and cognitive dissonance. To what extent did you look at the extent to which teachers were just, if you like, reinforcing what the students were doing well by writing well-written or good point or interesting insights? So they went back and said, my goodness, I must have said something fantastic there. To what extent did you deal with that aspect?
Okay. The second aspect, I think you're talking specifically about the final study there with the 88 one. We didn't actually look at that at all. In this particular context, what we did is, because when we went to the data, turns out in the real world, data are messier than in the lab. So when we went to look at these feedback scripts from the teachers, we decided to only focus on the kind of summative comments at the very end. So there were individual little comments, the well done and the good, and this is unclear throughout the responses, but we didn't look at those in terms of the data at all. There might have been something interesting there, but we needed to constrain what we were focusing on essentially. So I can't really answer the second part from a data perspective. The first part of your question was, I'm trying to, sorry actually, some paper to make notes. So can you remind me the first?
Taking criticism.
Yeah.
emotionally intelligent, really.
Sure.
So instead of being critical,
Yeah.
saying to people, this is an interesting paper, I'd like to see more of,
Yeah.
or could you add to, or this is interesting,
Yeah.
you could publish it if you did something, on this particular point. So
Thank
it's
you.
really more what I would call supportive rather than critical.
Sure. I think this is a very good point. It's exactly why I'm really, really keen to emphasise to people, don't stop doing feed forward just because these data look quite inconvenient for that approach. Because there's lots of other consequences of different kinds of feedback rather beyond just whether or not it's easily memorised. One of those consequences is whether it's really disheartening or whether it feels supportive. And actually, if you've got a choice between feedback that's supportive but unmemorable or unsupportive and memorable, there's a bit of a value judgment between which is preferable. And we certainly wouldn't want to create a scenario where we respond to this feedback by going, okay, we just need to give people criticism and judgment all the time because that's going to be really memorable, and then they stay at home crying every day. So I think there's a really important balance, which is why I'd say we need to address the issue in a different way rather than with these kind of quick fixes, which probably solve one problem but create 10 others. Thank you.
Any other? Okay, on the last.
Did you look at all into kind of self-assessment and whether if students are generating their own evaluative and directive feedback, that has more of an impact?
We haven't. The one finding we had earlier is that when you ask them to do this before receiving the feedback, it doesn't help to put them in a different mindset. That's probably the only direct finding that I can speak to with that. The one thing I can also say is that we find this effect. We've kind of tried cutting up the data in all different ways and figuring whether there's certain subgroups that get it more than others, and we've never really found that. One particularly interesting division is that you get this finding equally amongst students who say they're interested mostly in having future-oriented feedback and in students who say they're interested mostly in direct past-oriented feedback. So even the students who say, I'm really, really interested, I'd much rather receive information about how to improve, they still have the same as well. So I'm not sure I would expect it. Intuitively, I would expect that would make a difference, but based on what we found, I probably wouldn't.
Did you look at any gender differences? I'm just wondering whether girls are more sensitive towards critical feedback and so switch off maybe than boys.
Yeah, we've never specifically looked at it in every single study, but whenever we've looked just out of interest, we've never found anything. I think partly because this doesn't seem to be about emotional reactions. You know, if you're getting this effect when you're reading someone else's feedback, it suggests it's something perhaps a bit more cognitive rather than emotional. And it's probably a big generalisation to say that, you know, females would react to feedback more emotionally anyway. Please don't read that into my mouth, especially not in this room. So no, I don't think that would make a difference. We've looked at it informally and never found it.
My question was, you were talking about providing feedback and that actually we should continue to provide feedback. It doesn't necessarily mean to say that they might act on our feedback. And I just wondered whether or not when we provide feedback, one of the reasons why they don't remember it, perhaps the directive feedback, is simply because they don't feel that they have the skills in order to put that into action, and therefore, in a sense, that part of the feedback is irrelevant to me because I don't know what that next part should look like, and I haven't got those skills, so that is not relevant to me, and therefore, I just remember the bit that is.
Definitely, I would completely agree with what you said. In some of the other work that I very kind of cursorily skimmed over at the beginning, we find in our research that the barriers, the main barriers to students engaging with feedback, surprisingly are not the style in which it's written, or in some cases it is. But one of the big barriers is students just not feeling that they know how or they have the strategies to act upon what you're telling them to do. So they understand what you're saying, and they kind of know, perhaps even they feel ready and willing to do it in some cases, but just don't really know, like, they're telling me to be more critical, but what do I need to do to be more critical? One of the interesting findings we found in some of our other research is that when we ask people what do you see, both students and staff, we ask what do you see as the biggest problem that prevents students or you from using feedback. They never come up with this spontaneously as a reason. But when we then give them kind of a list of reasons and say which of these do you find is a problem for you, the use of knowledge of strategies comes out as the most important for everyone. So they don't think of it spontaneously, but they suddenly realise once you point it out that that's a massive problem for them. So that, I think, is something that we all need to work towards.
So if we learn them up some skills, they should be all right.
Yes. Some skills, please.
All right, thank you very, very
Thank
much.
Now we have the AGM, and I should just say at this point, if you're not a member of the ATP, then unfortunately I have to ask you not to be here. So if you're not a member of the ATP, could I ask you to just leave and have a coffee or a chat or something? Otherwise we'll get going with this as quickly as possible. There is a registration form coming around. We do need 25 people to make us call it. So please, if you are a member of the ATP, remain seated. Okay. So, firstly, we'll just go through the agenda as quick as we can do. Okay, copies of the agenda are coming round, and also copies of minutes and so on. I've received apologies from Helen Ansell. So far, and no others. As I said, minutes are being circulated.
Thank you so much.
So these are the minutes from the last AGM at Leeds. And the 2017 minutes were accepted, and officers' reports were delivered and accepted as well. And then the existing committee was elected and so on. And then the minute, obviously, then the meeting closed. I don't know if people had obviously a very brief chance to read this morning's